Cameroonians are expected to take to the streets tomorrow to once again agitate for change and reform. Cameroon's main opposition leader, Maurice Kamto, says that they will again demand that President Paul Biya step down and that regional elections in the Anglophone regions be reformed. Government has responded by putting all its military on alert for 4 days, fearing that tomorrow's protests could cause severe public disorder. A little earlier today, I spoke to the head of the Justice and Peacebuilding Programme at the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation, Professor Tim Murithi, about the political situation in Cameroon. And he began by telling me a little bit about the history. Professor Murithi, thank you very much indeed for joining us. There are planned protests in Cameroon for Tuesday, and the army has been deployed by the authorities in the country ahead of that. We believe there have been some arrests already made from last week of people who they believe might be involved in setting these protests up. To get a sense of what's happening now, I have a feeling we have to go back in time to almost get a sense of why what we're seeing today is happening.
Indeed, that's the right thing to do. The history of the Cameroon is quite an extensive one. Like many other African countries across our continent, the Cameroon was also colonized by a number of countries. In fact, 3 countries: Germany, France, and the United Kingdom. And the tension arises from, in fact, the subdivision of the territory that we call Cameroon, and the tension between 2 provinces in the north that were English-speaking and therefore under the tutelage of the United Kingdom or Britain, and those in the south that were under the tutelage of France. And prior to that, Germany was also a form of colonial power, so to speak. And after the end of the First World War, France and the United Kingdom took over. And so the independence of Cameroon, so to speak, from France in 1960, and then the subsequent unification, so to speak, if we put it in quotations, of what is now known as Anglophone Cameroon and what is Southern Cameroon, took place in 1961. And that's essentially where you see some of the tensions emerging. That process of unification became a little bit distorted in some ways. It became a little bit messy. There was an attempt to centralize and assimilate power in Yaoundé and almost marginalize and ignore these 2 northern provinces now known as Northwest and Southwest of Cameroon. But to give you some understanding, the decision at the time of independence, the 2 Cameroon provinces that were English-speaking had the option of joining Nigeria, which is the neighboring country to Cameroon, and actually chose to be Anglophone within a larger Francophone Cameroon to its south. And then a long history of marginalization and a gradual consolidation and the loss of autonomy, in fact, took place in the intervening decades, which leads us to where we are today. I think important to mention a plebiscite that took place in 1972, which essentially almost dissolved, what was then quite autonomous regions in the country. That brings us today where we have these tensions unfolding, a centralized system and a government that is reluctant essentially to cede greater autonomy to the region, and the declaration of independence that has since happened, in fact, in 1999 by these 2 Anglophone-speaking provinces to establish what they call the Republic of Ambazonia. And that's where we are today. These tensions have long-standing origins, and if we're really to try to solve the problem and move forward, we need to understand that, and then we need to adopt processes that will be introspective, that will create platforms for dialogue, and will also address the grievances of the human rights violations and the injustices that have been suffered, mainly in these two Anglophone provinces, but also in other parts of Cameroon due to the ongoing tension and that has been perpetrated in this crisis.
Fast forward to 2020, the opposition has been going to the elections. The opposition leader, Kamato, says that the last election was stolen and that Paul Biya is increasingly using force to stay in power. Is that a fair assessment?
Well, the evidence that has been collected by a number of organizations that have access to the situation on the ground are reporting something similar. This include, Centers for Human Rights, both African and international. There has been a legacy of authoritarianism and consolidation of power by the Biya regime, and a very long-standing rule, which in 2020 should be something that we as an African continent have moved beyond and have moved into a different realm of governments changing on a regular basis. And this is one of the longest standing leaders on the African continent. And that should already indicate that there is something fundamentally wrong with the whole picture, so to speak. Yes, the opposition will use the opportunity to obviously state its case and make its case, but there are merits to some of the criticisms that have emerged that have been verified by independent observers, as I said, both from Africa and from other parts of the world.
Deploying the military means that the authorities are not going to tolerate any kind of dissent. I've even heard them suggesting that people will be in prison for a long time if they support this protest tomorrow. Is there a fear that this could get violent, even though the protesters are saying that they are for non-violence?
Yes, and this will not be the first time, in fact, that we've had protests in Cameroon. We can go back to 2016 and to 2017, when there were quite, robust protests against precisely the issues we're discussing now. And in fact, it was a government, ruling to essentially ban protesting that has kind of not necessarily solved the issue, but put a lid on the crisis, which is in fact not the appropriate way to try to deal with the issues. And so this resurgence, I think, and protests is almost inevitable, because if the fundamental underlying issues are not addressed, then we will continue to see this type of an emergence. And in the absence of a strong intervention by regional organizations in the Central African, West African region, and the African Union in Addis Ababa, then we will continue to see the people take matters into their own hands. And there have been quite violent altercations between the security forces and the people on the ground, which has led to quite brutal, injuries, murders, and so on and so forth.
Can any other solution other than secession and full autonomy be acceptable to the opposition? Is there a middle ground?
There is always a middle ground. I think there's always the famous third way, the common ground. The challenge is the time factor, the extent to which this issue has been left to simmer. But there is a middle ground. There are many examples around the world of regions with quite high levels of autonomy that do not necessarily secede from the central state. And so I think that should really be strong on the agenda. Efforts to establish dialogue platforms, because I mentioned the regional organizations have faltered. They haven't necessarily been sustained. And there's almost been a regional fatigue with trying to resolve the Cameroonian issue. At the same time, the Biya government saying that this is an internal matter that should be resolved exclusively through internal means, which is not necessarily the best way to go if there's a sense of a critique of legitimacy from one side to the other. And so we're almost in limbo. And I think this is the latest effort to try to get some momentum going, to try to move this process towards some kind of a solution that people could live with.
All right, so sometimes the Cameroon story can be reduced to Anglophone, Francophone conversations, but are there Francophone Cameroonians who are also fed up with their president?
Oh, inevitably so. Inevitably. I think any president who served for, going on to 40 decades, it's too long. If you think about it, for any particular country, that wouldn't really be acceptable. Even the African Union's own charter for democracy, elections, and governance, this is an African Union document, calls for the regular transfer of power, and inevitably is so. And I think you're right to point out that this is strictly not a Francophone Anglophone crisis. It could have been, it could be divided in multiple dimensions. It is a crisis of legitimacy. It is a crisis of the failure to deliver on social, economic improvement and livelihoods of people in these marginalized provinces, and access to education. The things that people need to improve themselves, healthcare, they can live healthy lives, infrastructure so that they can trade with the rest of the world. These are fundamentally the issues that we should be focusing on addressing, rather than always reducing it to an identity-based conflict, which is sometimes inaccurate and in fact misleading.
All right, so the status quo clearly is unsustainable and that something has to give. What do you think will happen from tomorrow and in the near term?
Well, based on previous evidence, the government has stated quite clearly that it will use force to contain any of the protests that will take place tomorrow. And this has actually been spread over a 4-day period. So, this is quite an extensive lockdown by military means, if you will. And that's unsustainable in the long run. So if the people are brave enough, they will come out to the streets. Unfortunately, then there will be some fatalities, which is never something that anybody would want to see. And then there will be a buildup again for a subsequent action from not only the opposition, but the movements that are rising. There's some non-political movements that are not linked to any political party that are calling precisely for the same thing, for, an open process, a dialogue, a solving of some of the fundamental issues, so the country can finally move forward. And I think we should be appealing to all regional actors, continental actors, and international actors to actually allow this process to move forward by supporting it how they can from the sides, rather than playing these sometimes nefarious games of only trying to seek advantage, self-advantage in such a crisis.